I'd like to welcome you to this presentation titled Helping Feed the World, A History of Farming in Genesee, Idaho. My name is Merle Bennett. This is September of 2023, and I'm making this presentation in cooperation with the Genesee Civic Association, and I'd like to thank all of you for watching. As a geologist, we need to start off with the basics on why we have the soil that we have. This is a basalt quarry on the way over to Pullman, and you can see the basalt's down at the bottom here with all this nice blocky material in here. And but on top of it, there's a big pile of sediment. And if you look at that, it's very, very fine, semi to unconsolidated dust and silt. And this is windblown sediment that came in at the end of the last glaciation that covered much of the Columbia River Plateau and is what we call the Palouse Formation. It's also known as loess, which means it's the glacial glacial dust that blew in here. That's what makes our wonderful soil, and it's almost perfect for growing wheat and the other crops that we're able to do. Now, the first gentleman that came through and wrote down what he saw when he came through our area was Isaac Stevens in 1853. He was appointed the governor of the Washington Territory and charged with doing three things: find a railroad route, sign treaties with all the Native Americans, and manage this vast area over which there were hardly any maps. So right off the bat, he makes a trip up through Moscow and Genesee, and it's our first written description that we have in the railroad survey that he published about what our area looked like. And for the purpose that we're after, just note, he mentions the luxuriances of the grass and the richness of the soil, and he does that several times. The soil like that of the prairies of Illinois. So that's our first description that how cool this was going to be. Now, accompanying the governor on his survey was a gentleman named Gustav Sohan, and this is a lithograph that he made. He was an artist, and it was taken from Crooks Hill, looking to the northeast, and it shows what the Palouse looked like before there was any changes to it at all, before we farmed anything. Now you can see the foothills were right on the eastern edge of the Palouse here, so the foothills, which are all older rocks, are sticking up above all of this many feet of basalt that is below us here. I just got a new photo taken from Steptoe Butte by Rich Miller, and Steptoe Butte has one of the largest acreages of undisturbed original prairie left, and that's what you see in the foreground of this picture. In the back, you can see what originally Sohan sketched as continuing prairie all the way is now completely taken over for agriculture. Well, from Stevens' times up to 1860, things went pretty well. He did get all of his treaties signed with the Native American groups, including the Nimiipuu or Nez Perce, which is the tribe of interest to us. But in 1860, Elias Davidson Pearson and his crew will discover gold over near Pierce, Idaho, and all of the relatively peaceful times is going to change. The first thing they realized was this was going to bring thousands of people into the area, and they needed to make some changes. So what they did was wrote a new treaty with the Native Americans, which was finally ratified in 1867, which greatly reduced the size of the reservation that had been established by the 1855 treaty. Now, as soon as that was done, you could begin surveying the area, and you couldn't get on federal land until it had been surveyed. You weren't supposed to. And this is one of the ways that you could buy federal land after it had been surveyed. It's called the Preemption Act, and you could just flat buy federal land. That was the easiest way to do it if you had the money. The second way, of course, was the Homestead Act of 1862. If you lived on the land for 5 years and made improvements, you got your 160 acres for a very tiny cost. Another act was the Timber Culture Act of 1873. That was for another 160 acres. Same type of deal as the Homestead Act, and many people in the Genesee area would file on both of them. And last, you could purchase railroad land. When the Northern Pacific Railroad came into Spokane Falls in 1882, there had not been a penny's worth of federal money spent on it because the federal government didn't have any money. It wasn't until 1913 that we had income tax. So, but what they did do was they gave the railroad thousands and thousands of acres of land. For every mile that they progressed with their railroad, they got many, many sections of land and they were able to sell that. Well, it was land right near the railroad. So, of course, you would purchase that. It was only for a few cents more per acre than the federal government was charging under the preemption. And just for scale, when we're going to talk about acres and that kind of land, how big is an acre? Well, it's 209 feet on a side. This shows that on a standard baseball diamond. So that square in the area there is about equal to 0.43 baseball fields. So it's a couple hundred feet on a side. That gives you an idea when we talk acres what we're going to do. A square mile was equal to one section, which is 640 acres. Now, the first roads that were used in the area were the Native American trails, but for our purposes, we're looking at the first road that was actually engineered from Lewiston up to the top of the Rimrock country where Genesee is located. And this was known as the Silcott Road. It was completed in 1874. But before that, in 1867, Pearson Caldwell and Hall had built a building at the top of the hill on the Rimrock, and it would become the way station for everybody that would be coming up the Silcott Road. And it's now known as the Ruddy Collins Place. Was the oldest standing building in Whitman County, and if it's just a stone's throw from Latah County, and it would certainly be the oldest in our county as well. Although Caldwell and Hall were cattlemen, they did plant by hand the first 40 acres of wheat at the Ruddy Collins Place in 1868. And their market was probably Fort Lapwai, which had been built on the reservation in 1862. They would sell the land to Michael Ruddy, and that's why we call it the Michael Ruddy or the Ruddy Collins Place. The gentleman on the right with the beard is James Hall, and the gentleman in the lower left with the buffalo coat is William Caldwell. So that's our first farmers, if you will, that were in our area. And this is what their house looked like after several revisions. You can see it was built, they built onto it in the back. Right next to it that we can't see was a early granary that was put up. It was probably certainly one of the oldest ones within the state. This building, of course, is on the National Historic Register. Unfortunately, the gentleman that owned it was concerned because it had been abandoned for some time and it was burned down just a couple of years ago. And we mentioned that these gentlemen were primarily raised cattle. And the brands would be published in the Lewiston Teller. This is from 1882. And there's some very familiar names up here. Rufus Beeman was one of the very first people that settled in the Genesee area. It's known as the Rudolph Norby Place today. It was the first post office even before there was a town. It was a postal drop, I should say. And Beeman would, a couple times a week, take tables out of his barn and sell merchandise to the few residents that were in the area. The Spurbeck family, another very old family name. Euler, another one in Genesee. H.B. Hodgins, one of our first residents. Hodgins would build our first drugstore in town. His son would build Hodgins Drug in Moscow, which is pretty well known. The Tweed family had their cattle and they had their own brand. This is out where Murray Myers lives today, and so on and so forth. So there was a few of them, and some didn't even bother with any brands. They just let their cattle run wherever they were going to go. And this was a bit of a problem because we are very close in Genesee to the northern boundary of the new Nez Perce Reservation, as was described in the 1863 treaty. Well, we can never have one of these presentations without mentioning John Vollmer, the first millionaire in Idaho Territory. He would build banks and stores in almost every one of these little towns. And he was also the agent for the Spokane and Palouse Railroad, which would become a branch of the Northern Pacific Railroad, which he will bring into the Genesee area in 1888. And there's our first map that we have. It's a Sanborn map, as they're called. And we just want to use this to show the depot was there, but there were three grain storage terminals set in almost immediately because everybody knew that that's what was going to be the future of this area. Now, just a few notes that might be of interest to you about wheat, because that's what most of our talk is going to be about. Wheat provides about 20% of the calories for the world's current 8 billion people. That is immense as far as how we feed human beings. A bushel of wheat makes about 90 1-pound loaves of whole wheat or 42 loaves of white bread. So you get a big bang for your buck when you're growing wheat. And worldwide, more foods are made with wheat than any other grain. A little history on it. Wheat was first used by early humans over 20,000 years ago. They were still hunter-gatherers at the time, but they learned that this wild wheat that was growing out there, that you could eat those kernels off of it. And in Jordan, 14,000 years ago, wheat was being used to make flatbread already. And between 10 to 12,000 years ago, farming began in the Fertile Crescent, and that was really the beginning of the new civilization where we would establish cities and you could live there, because now we had a food source that few people could process, and the other people then could specialize in other areas like we would have in our normal economy. A little bit of where we stand on our national ranking. This is 2021 numbers. You can see we're in spring wheat. We're number 4 in the United States. We also grow beans and peas and a few other things. We rank number 5 in that. Within the state, our value of our crops every year is over $8 billion. And when we look at the commodities produced within Idaho, wheat ranks right in the top 4 or 5 commodities, behind milk, cattle, calves, potatoes, hay, and then we have wheat. Now, this is the different kinds of wheat that we grow in Idaho: hard red winter, hard red spring, soft red winter, soft white wheat, soft white spring, hard white wheat, and durum. Each one of them has slightly different uses, and most of our wheat that we raise is soft white, and almost all of it is exported generally to the Asian countries. Slide showing you some of the very early wheat species that we had. The two, for example, on this slide, the emmer and the einkorn, date back to at least 6800 BC. The spelt on the side is probably very close to what people, the hunter-gatherers, were using hundreds of thousands of years, many thousands of years ago. The big wheat that was imported into the United States was brought into Kansas by Mennonites who were settling in the area in 1874. And it would become the primary wheat that would be grown in the Midwest, and with slight variations, much of the wheat that would be grown early on in Genesee. Now, this is what it looked like. This is Ed Steltz. His farm was a little southeast of our current town right now, and he was 6 foot tall. You can see how tall that wheat is, and notice the spaces between it. There's quite a bit of gap in there, and much of the energy within this wheat was being used by the stems themselves to grow. So it wasn't the most efficient form we could have. Now, to back up just a bit, we got to go back to 1837 by the development of John Deere of the modern, what we call foot burner plow. There were plows before this, certainly they look very similar to this. But what Deere did was he took a steel saw blade from a sawmill, and he bent it into the shape of what the normal plows of the day looked like, but it was made out of steel. Steel was very difficult to make in those days. It would be wouldn't be until about 1852 that the Bessemer process was developed and we could make all the steel. The plows earlier were made out of cast iron. Cast iron has one really bad feature to it, and that's that clay sticks to cast iron like there's no tomorrow. And that's a big problem. Your plow balls right up in a hurry if you've got a lot of clay. It does not stick to steel. So it was not only a little lighter, it was much better to use for agriculture. And we don't have a huge amount of clay in our area, but where it is, it's useful. So these are two of the plows that are out at White Springs Ranch. The big plow is the one that we would use to break the original sod, which the soil was pretty deep with all those thousands of years worth of native vegetation that had grown on it. But once you had broken the soil, the next time you needed to plow it, you could get away with using at times a little smaller plow, as we see here. What did they pull their single bottom plow with in those days? Anything that they had. You could hook your cows to it, you could hook a horse to it, any combination. It would take a little while before we were economically viable enough that you could use the standard 2-horse pull on your foot burner. And here's what one would look like when it was in action. See the gal watch it, whoop, stumble a little bit, hard to keep it balanced. You can imagine doing that all day long. Now, the progress that would quickly be made would be to put the plow, and this would be a 2-bottom plow instead of a single one, with wheels on either side of it. And one of the wheels was usually canted so you could, it would go over the rough ground. The other wheel was on the ground that had not yet been disturbed. It took a few more horses to pull it. They put seats on these at one time, but almost all farmers preferred to stand up. They had much better control over their horses by standing up. So although they didn't have to walk all day, they were still standing up all day. And this is the Gilbert Smith from the Detlef Smith farm, which is just north of Genesee here. Now you could run these in larger groups to get your work done a little faster. The bottom line on this is a 7 2-bottom plows that are being used on the Gaines Mix Ranch, which is just north of Moscow, and they could turn about 5 acres per team per day. That's pretty small. And of course, in more recent times, we replaced that with 8 or 9 bottom hydraulically powered plows pulled by very powerful machines, Caterpillars in this case. And of course, today we don't see a lot of plowing going on. It's it causes problems for us with erosion. There are other ways that we've now planted in which we can protect that very precious soil. Well, once it's plowed, the land is still a bit lumpy, so you have to smooth it over a little bit by hooking a harrow up and dragging it over the ground to knock out the big lumps, if you will. And there's many different kinds of those, which we can see operating in Genesee over the spring and fall. Well, once you've got your ground ready to go, we've got to plant it. This is Jethro Tull in 1701, during what's known as the British Agricultural Revolution. He invented a seed drill. This was, instead of having to plant those seeds by hand, you now had a little machine that would do it. And a slightly more modern version, which you can see all over the Palouse, looks like this. Lots of people have these in their farmyards, and it was the same thing. It would put a little furrow in the ground, drop a seed, cover it up, drop another seed, cover it up, and so on. You could plant about 12 to 14 acres a day with the 4-horse 8-foot drill. Like this one. And again, we would go ahead and we could put it together in more larger groups. This is a set of harrows that are being used at the same, and right after they would harrow the ground, then they could go in with a drill and seed it. And so each of the units up here for seeding could do about 18 acres a day, and the harrows could each do about 40 acres a day. So we're improving it certainly over what we would do by hand. Now that first 40 acres that would have been harvested at the top of the ridge near Genesee would have been cut using a hand sickle. This is a much earlier one that goes back thousands of years. It's a wooden handle in which they put sharpened pieces of obsidian, very sharp glass, which they then can use to cut the wheat by hand. Well, that would be improved, of course, by using a scythe, which was a lot more efficient, and then you could hook. You could put this piece here on, which is known as a cradle scythe, and that would gather up a bunch of wheat, which you could then drop off. So you're concentrating the wheat, and that's what all of this is going to be from now on, is materials handling. How can you handle this material the quickest way and the most efficient and the cheapest way? And that's what we're going to see how we did. To replace all that handwork, Cyrus McCormick in 1831 invented our first reaper. And it's a very simple device. There's a reel in the front here that would bend over the wheat as you're pulling this along with a horse. In the bottom here, there's a sickle, a bar sickle cutter that would move back and forth and cut the wheat off, which would then fall on this platform. And you could have a gentleman going along behind it with a fork. That when it got full, he just fork it off and leave you with a nice bundle of wheat. Well, there was lots of attempts very quickly, of course, to improve on this. We could get rid of that man with the fork. And this was the McCormick self-raking raper, which was made for over 100 years and was a very interesting device, as we will see. This is what one looked like. You did not want to fall asleep while you were operating this one, or you would be waxing your head. See those rakes? Cut the grain. The rakes now are going to sweep it off periodically. You need to change them with the handwork, which is fork walking behind it. We would improve on that process very quickly. This is a header machine, a wheat header. It's horses pulling the reel with a cutter bar beneath it that is hooked onto a conveyor that will take it up and put it into this specially designed wagon that's low on one side so that you can load the wheat into it. Their men would move it around with forks until your wagon was full, and then you'd have another one that would come up and replace it. This 14-foot header could do about 25 acres a day. And we could see how those worked at the Colfax threshing demo that we have every September 1st. And you can see the special header wagon there.
2008, we're at Colfax again for the harvest. We're looking at the guys running the header machine.
Again, notice that step over to the left, and they're going to help turn the machine They all fall back in line. The gentleman turn the rudder, bring the wagon up, and off we go. We made a nice square cut. I'm showing it's a lot of people to do. Well, here's one on the Hampton Driscoll Ranch, just east of town here. It's got a new addition on it. This machine would work just the same way as the headers, except that it had a knotting machine on it. So it would cut a bunch of wheat and then wrap it up with baling wire. And later, very shortly after that, we would use rope, and it would leave you with a sheaf of wheat laying on the ground. Improve that machine a little bit. Again, this looks an awful lot like that original machine that McCormick invented, but it's got the knotting machine tied up to it. It's dropping off bundles of wheat as it goes along. And here's how one would looks like when it's in action. See, it's tied into bundles, and away they go. Now, once the bundles were in the field, you would have gentlemen called shockers who would come pick up those bundles and put them into stacks or into shocks. And this is the Mix Brothers Ranch, again, just north of Moscow, in action. And the way they would do that was that maybe some time before your threshing machine, if you didn't own your own, before the threshing machine would show up and you were ready to harvest your wheat. So this was a way to keep the water off of it, and you could cut it a little green, which would give it a little bit more time to ripen in the shocks. Now, the first threshing machine was invented in 1786 by a Scotsman named Andrew Meikle, and they were widely used, of course, as soon as they became available. The first ones were horse-driven, and they would hook a horse, would be a harness to each of these and walk around in a circle all day. It would drive a pile here, which would hook to a gear on the bottom, convert it into a drive shaft, which would go over and run the power. This was known as a sweep and was effective, but again, takes a lot of horses and a lot of people. Here's one in action. This is up on a farm in Thorn Creek, just north of us here. Now, this is one of the earliest threshing machines that I've ever seen in our area. It's at the Lions Club Museum over in Cottonwood. It was shipped around the Horn on a sailing boat and then up the Columbia River on a steamboat in 1887. It could process maybe 10 acres a day. Notice that most of the body of it is made in wood with iron and steel pieces that are used where it's necessary especially for the moving parts. And how did it work? Well, surprisingly, it worked very similar to the way that the modern ones do today. The wheat would be forked into this receiver here, and then inside would be a device called a cylinder concave. And the cylinder would go around, knock the kernels out of the heads of the wheat. They will go down through the concave, which is a screen, be caught on this board down here. The straw would go over the top by what's called a beater, which would continue to work it over these straw walkers, and wheat grains would continue to would fall out through the screen down here at the bottom onto this moving belt down here. A large fan down below would constantly blow air over the top of the grain, which would remove a lot of the chaff and other material that you didn't want in your grain. Of quite efficient, and as I said, similar to what we do today. Here's an ad for one of them, very similar to what we were talking about, except it's got a um, grain elevator on it. Now, this way you could move when the grain was coming out of the machine, you could move this to wherever you needed to have it positioned so that your sack sowers and your sack jigs could fill up bags of wheat. It also had a moving elevator on. This would be improved in another model in which they had what was called a wind stacker. A big fan was installed down here, and it would blow the straw out, and you could move that back and forth over a pile. Now, since these were stationary machines, they would often be placed very close to where the farmhouse was, or where they could get some logistical support fairly quickly. Considerably different than what would happen with the combine. Now, here is a early model, somewhat crude, of how a more modern combine would do this process. The wheat is pushed over by the reel. It's cut by the cutter bar here. There's an auger or a screw, which then brings the wheat, depending on how big your header is, into a central conveyor, where it goes up the little conveyor here into the cylinder concave, and then it's just the same as we talked about. Here's the wheat that's being reclaimed. The straw walkers would move the waste straw out the back, and this is what the inside of that cylinder concave look like. There's the screen that the wheat grains will fall through. There's the thing that's crushing it, or not actually knocking the wheat out of it, and this is the next wheel that's sitting there that's moving the straw out across the straw walkers. And that's very similar to the way the newest machines work, but they're oriented differently, and they have a lot more efficiency designed into them than this one does. Here's a picture of a early threshing machine. It's made out of steel now. You're starting to get a lot of steel plate involved, but it's being driven by a steam engine known as a steam donkey. And this was not a problem with these early threshing machines, because, as I said, they were stationary. So once you haul this thing out there and you hook the belts up to drive the machine, you were okay. And here's another example. This is on the Cambridge Casper farm, just to the north of Genesee here, and you can see the stationary steam engine that they've got here with a long belt that goes out to the threshing machine. I should note that all these pictures are posed. The photographers of the day, the cameras were fairly slow, and any motion would show up as a big blur on their pictures. They would be posed, and the local photographers would always show up at the farms during harvest to get these kinds of pictures taken for the families, because number one, the families, of course, liked the pictures, but number two, it was one of the very few times of the year they had any money that they could spend or pay the photographer to take these pictures. This is the grain elevator here, and this is two gentlemen are what we call the sack sower and the sack jig. This is on the Cluss farm again, which is just north of town. And just to show you these, how colorized and how nice the enhancement and the colorization brings out these pictures, I left a very similar picture in. This is out on the Schooler farm, which is just east of town. Now the firebox here, it was designed, this long belt was designed to keep the firebox away from the wheat dump out here and the new wheat that was being brought in. Fires were fairly prevalent these days with these kinds of early machines, that all that metal going around would generate a lot of sparks. And here's another Schooler picture. This one, they've got a little tent built for their sack jig, and so he's not in the direct sun all day. They will be working from sun up to sundown outside all day long. A number of breaks, of course. In August, it's very hot. The horses are just as bad as the people as far as needing water. So occasionally, depending on how hot it is, you'll have to stop and water these animals as well as all the people. And here's a close-up of the sack jig. He's got the grain is coming down here. He's got a sack on one side of this tube and then a sack on the other side. He'll fill up one of them. pass it over here to the sack sewer, who then will take a needle, put 13 stitches across the top of the bag, pick the bag up, and move it to a pile. While that's going on, the other bag is filling on the other side. As soon as it's full, this sack sewer will do the same thing. The sack jig then has already got hung an empty sack over here, and back and forth it goes. They could produce, when everything was going well, about a sack a minute, and each one of them weighed 130 pounds. This is the Schluter farm, just to the east of us here. Very similar picture, but this one was hand colored. You could do this in the days. A number of people had it done. I put it in there just to show the comparison of what a early colored picture would look like, of course, compared to the ones that we have done on a computer by enhancing and colorizing images. This is the Fisk and Fogelstrom Carlson threshing crew. They were commercial. They would go from farm to farm to farm just to handle the threshing for these people. Again, you can see the water wagon here, the steam engine, and in the back, the cook shack, and the ladies sitting there because they are instrumental. They will be working just as hard as the men. Here's the Bromling farm over to the north and east of us a ways. They're threshing shocks of wheat, as you can see, or sheaves of wheat, sorry, from the shocks in their combine. Now, everybody got in on the act. This is a card that was produced by Herman's Hardware down where Roach Construction is today. The handy reference list of all the things that you could buy at Herman's for harvest. And it was for the cookhouse, for the engine that was driving your machine, for the men who were working on your crew, and so on and so forth. So this is a demo, again, of how it works. Guys over there. We're loading wood into the fire box. Some of them burn straw. That was also burn coal. With the ball fire, is the governor. Wagons that they had, quickly hooked up. They were hooked up, and the horses installed this. They could raise the wagon up if they got close to the end of the cross. Look at all the belts here. The ladies we mentioned worked just as hard as the men. Here they are at the cook shack. They had to provide all the 3 meals a day for the men. And there was an interesting side to this. These farms were remote. Women were far relatively far away from other people. And it was a chance for the young ladies to uh, communicate with these young men who had come in to help out with the harvest. Now, they were all too busy for too much hanky-panky to be going on, but there were people who met that way and would get married and do their thing. Now, this is a picture, looks like the same thing out of Greg Moser's farm north of town here, but look at the arrow. What is that thing that they were using? Well, there's a blow up of it. It's one of the very first kerosene or gas engines that was used to replace the steam machine. And it was very efficient. You didn't have to fuel it all day long. Once it was set up, again, it was pretty easy to use and would save you money. Here's another picture of one operating over near Uniontown. Again, gas engine in action here with a long belt going out to the threshing machine. Well, about 1910, we began to use more conventional types of tractors were developed. This is the case with the steel wheels on it. It's again doing the same thing to drive the threshing machine. Well, all those people involved, somebody got the idea that why don't we combine the header and the thresher? And in 1935, this was set up so just a few men could operate that whole system. And this is a very early combine that's out at Ebel's Ranch north of town, drawn by about 30 to 32 horses and mules, or if you just use mules, you could get by with a few less. And we'll see how that worked in a minute. Again, notice the wheat, very high and lots of spaces in between the heads on it, and very small heads. To keep the horses and mules, who are like humans, some work very hard all the time, some will slough off the minute you give them a chance. They invented what was called a cloverleaf hitch. It was designed so that any animal that started sloughing off a little bit would show up quite obviously with this type of hitch, and you could get a few words then from the driver to the mule skinner, or who would get the horses back in line. The mule skinner had two reins, only two, that went way out to the first two lead horses here, and the rest of the rest of the horses would follow those two. Now, the men that are involved here include the mule skinner that we've got here, the header operator, who's going to turn a wheel like a steering wheel, and that will move the header up and down to compensate for changes in the terrain. Behind him will be the mechanic, and his job is to keep the combine level. And they had two long levers that they could turn. It was all done mechanically, and they could jack up one side or down on the other side to make it level. If it wasn't level, the grain, of course, would all pile up on one side or the other of the combine, and you'd have a gigantic mess. They could produce handle about 30 acres per day at 20 to 40 bushels per acre, which would have been the standard yield that we had at the time. Another beautiful picture of the animals pulling these machines. You can see the sack sower and the sack jig, same deal. They would take the grain, put it in the sack, same way they had done it with the threshing machines. And an absolutely gorgeous picture of one. Notice the combine's a little bit smaller because instead of wood, which is what all the early ones were made out of and were very heavy, they were able to start to lighten it up a little bit by using more and more steel plates in place of the wood that was made up the combine before. This is the Jane farm just east of town. Again, a beautiful picture of it. The sack jigs this was a relatively new device. It was a ramp in which you could put 5 bags of wheat, then they would flip a trip and it would drop all 5 in one spot, which made it easier and more efficient for the guys that had to come and pick up the bags. The real advantage, of course, of all of this was it cost $1 to $1.50 an acre to combine it versus $3 to $4 per acre by the old threshing machine methods. Now, these combines were all driven early on by ground power. These big wheels going around provided all the motive power that was operating within the machine. And if you weren't very careful, or you had the misfortune to hit a gopher hole, you could tip the things over. And that was not infrequent that it would happen, of which it would make quite a mess. Here's one out on to show you the mule skinner who sat out here way out on this little his seat here, which was known as the perch or his crow's nest. He's got his two jerk lines out to the front of his horses, and he would be constantly saying to them, "Ha ha," which would mean the horses were to turn to the left, or perhaps "Gee gee," which meant they would turn back to the right. So there was a lot of action going on in these machines all the time. They could operate on fairly steep hillsides as shown here. Again, the mechanic's job was to keep that thing level, and the header operator, he had to tip this up and down to make sure that it was cutting the right amount of wheat. A very, very famous picture from over near Walla Walla of 5 of these horse-drawn machines. This has been a combining company that would have done this. They would have moved in with all these machines to do your property. 33 horses were pulling these. That's 165 total, and they're pulling these big Holt combines. Now, we would make a little bit of progress for some of our area. There was a company called the Idaho National Harvester Company that was stationed in Moscow. Their factory was where Rosars is now in Moscow. And this is what their machine looked like. Wow, only took 2 people to drive it. You had a gentleman that pushed the horses. This is just like a header. And then you had a sack jig sitting here who took care of sewing up the sack. The rest of it all ran from the power of the ground wheel here, which moved along. And the little giant could do about 15 acres a day. And if you got into tougher terrain, you could have another model in which you could have horses in the front pulling as well as horses behind pushing. Here we can see now we've got to have 3 men because we've got to have a sack jig, and he'll pile up the sacks here so that they can be dropped off on the ground. One of these is still in existence that I know of over in Cottonwood, and this is Elmer Kraut, who we're going to see was quite an inventor in his own right, demonstrating how you would sit in the little harvester. This is one of the most famous tape segments that you'll see. It's an actual horse-drawn combine in action. It's from WSU's archives. It's been seen all over the world. It's one of the very few you will ever see of how these machines work and how the men work. You can see they're all working. Look at pulling on those reins, turning that wheel to make sure that header is just right. There's a picture from the perch and what he sees. A very important job because on the hilly country, when those horses would go over a hill, the driver couldn't see what was happening when the horses started down the hill until they got up a ways. So there was concern about what happening to the horses as they went over. This was a relatively new invention. There you go. They're dropping the 4 or 5 sacks of wheat, which makes it easier to do. And there's a picture of the ground wheel going along that's providing all the power, and the mechanic keeping that sucker just as level as he can while the header puncher works the header on that side. Anyway, that's the only moving picture I have ever seen of one of these early combines in action, and is quite spectacular. Well, this one looks like the same thing, except whoops, we've added something else here in the front. We've added a gas engine to it. We're still going to use ground power for part of the power, but much of it now is going to be provided by a gas engine. And this will become very common gas engine use around World War I, when we used a lot. We had by then lots and lots of gas engines that were being developed for all kinds of things. It could do this again is out on the Stelz Ranch. We've got a 12-foot wide path, It only needed 3 men to operate, and they could do 20 acres a day, which was pretty good for those days. Now the horses are still out here in front. They're still being horse driven. Here we are on Hampton Ranch. Again, we can see the same type of thing. The number of men that are out there. This was, you can see the gas or the exhaust pipe here coming up from the engine. Mr. Hampton always had a model layout in the field because the combines now were not right next to the farm. They were out in the bush. And so when parts would break and so on, you would need the roustabout or Mr. Hampton and his Ford to go get the parts and whatever else you needed to feed these men or to get new parts for the machine. Now this looks like the same thing, but it's not, because what we're doing here is the grain elevator is now going into a hopper on the top of the machine. And we're going to eliminate the sacks. We're going to change from sack grain to bulk grain. And this is about 1913 is when they started to do it. Here's a picture of one of the newer machines now with a truck, early truck, which would drive up alongside, and they would just put the loose grain in. The loose grain would then be driven to an elevator where it could be stored. And this is the East End elevators in Genesee early on. There's our sack warehouse where we stored all those sacks until we could ship it. That was built in 1912. Our first wood elevator, 1918. And then concrete tanks or silos, which would be the next generation of the elevators, put in 1926 and 24. But no mistake about it, horses were hugely important. This is the Follett and Schooler who raised horses. They would bring super horses in from all over the country for breeding practice, for breeding and so on. Very, very serious business. Some of the farms would build special round barns. You could put wheat in or store the hay on the top. The horses would be stabled in a circle around the bottom down here. So a lot of effort went into maintaining these horses. And of course, they would be celebrated by our wonderful horse parades, which went in Genesee from 1910 to 1916. Here those gorgeous animals are on parade in our 1910 picture. 1911, same type of thing, but what is that? It's an automobile downtown. We're starting to get cars in the area. In 1913, they had one car join the parade as it went downtown with all those horses. By 1914, there were 99 automobiles in the parade, and they would extend the celebration an extra day. They would have a horse parade one day and a car parade the next day. Well, as you can see, horses are going to be on their way out, and here's a very famous picture, 1923, out on the Hampton Farm. There's our mules pulling a combine. There's the replacement, the first Caterpillar pulling a very similar combine behind it. A staged picture, you bet. They had to do it twice. They originally had the Caterpillar in the front. It made so much noise that it freaked out all the horses that were behind it, so they had to change it around. How fast did it change? This is Ahern's farm around Genesee. Having purchased the tractor, he's disposing of all of his mules, all of his horses, all of the harness, all of the equipment that they needed to support those horses from the early days. And what was it replaced with? You got it. Track-driven machines. This is a poster for the evolution of the best. Benjamin Holt would build the first crawler tractor in 1904. Daniel Best would produce the first gas-powered machine in 1908. The two companies would merge in 1925 as the Caterpillar Company. Back then, they showed the advertisement of the best steam tractors of olden times. And there's one, right, that one right there, pulling one of these very early machines. Well, they were very heavy. It could cause problems if you weren't careful, just like the big combines tipping over in gopher holes. If you had to go across these bridges that were built across railroad tracks, you had to be very careful because you could get in some serious trouble with those. On a picture of an early one of these Caterpillar type machines pulling a updated gas-powered harvesting machine. And this is a picture of a Best 60, which was uh, hugely popular in both the logging industry and was perfect for farming. Notice there was no steering wheel. They had two levers up here that they moved back and forth, which would stop and start the tracks, and that's the way you would turn the machine. This is a picture of Elmer Kraut over on the right with his number 10 cat, which was about the size of some of the smaller ones that they would have run. And Wade Hampton standing next to a number 65 cat, which in its day, this was used to show the difference in the size. If you took one of the tractors we use today and put it next to the 65, it would look about the same proportions as it does to the number 10 in this picture. A picture of a Best tractor on the Nelson Ranch, southeast of Moscow. Here's a tractor pulling a powered combine, but again, it's much smaller because much of it is now being made out of metal. It's more efficient. Well, another major change that will happen is by the son of Haywire Hampson, who ran the Riverside Pavilion up near Potlatch for many years. Haywire could fix anything with baling wire, and hence his nickname. And his son was even better as a mechanic, Ray Hansen. Ray Hansen would invent the automatic leveling machine. This was hydraulics, and this was the beginning of where instead of having all this hand power, we're going to be able to do things with hydraulic controls. His selling point was, let me install this in your combine. If you don't like it, we'll take it out. They put it in 2,000 machines and never were asked to take one out. And here's what the newer combines would look like. Now we've got the trucks, the better trucks that are hauling along. And this is what the mechanism would be used to level the machine, except now it's all being driven by hydraulics, but the same kind of idea. This is what the ones that were on the very early wooden combines look like. Well, back to a picture of Mr. Stelz out there, 6 foot tall in his grain. And here's, my gosh, a guy standing in a new field of grain today. What on earth happened? What happened was the Green Revolution, which happened post 1945. Population of the Earth at the time was 2.4 billion people. We now have 8 billion people that we reached in 2022. There was huge concern at the end of the war because the damage had been caused throughout the world that there were going to be a worldwide famine. And it was known that the types of grain that was grown at the time, there was no way they were going to be able to feed much more of a population growth, which was fully expected. The father of the Green Revolution, as it's known, was Norman Borlaug. Most of his work was done in Mexico and India. He was able to produce the dwarf types of wheat now versus the Russian red, very short stems, very long heads, very high yields. He would receive the Nobel Prize in 1970 for his work. And this is a statue that was put in a statuary hall in the Capitol. Iowa took out the standard statue of one of their political bees and stuck in a much more important person to them, who was Norman Borlaug. Now, Borlaug would be helped by work both at WSU and U of I and other universities around the country, but there were some downsides of this. And one of them was that these dwarf forms of wheat, the shorter wheat, required more water, and they also required they had to be fertilized. And you can see that the McGregor Company gets its start in 1948. They produce fertilizer bring fertilizer into almost every small farming community in our area. So it was something that could be solved relatively easily. Now, there's Elmer Kraut and Wayne Roach, who started Roach Construction. They were both very innovative guys. They took a standard combine, pull combine, and they converted it into a self-propelled combine in 1952. Now, we already had self-propelled combines then, so why did they do it? Well, farmers are known to be, how should we say, economically conservative. And so they thought they'd save a few bucks by converting one of their old machines to a combine. Well, that was fine, and it worked reasonably well, but nothing quite as good as the John Deere 55, which was invented or first introduced in 1946 and along with other machines that look very similar to this, made by different companies, would become the way that we would process grain in the future. Here are three of them going across the field, just like we might have had three huge teams pulling those early combines. Well, here's Carol taking a picture of that early combine, about 10 acres that we could do a day. And here's a lady standing next to the John Deere GeneseeAg2023, which costs right at $1 million today. The one Carol's photographing could do maybe 10 acres a day at 20 bushel per acre. This one can do 30 acres of wheat in an hour at 100 bushels per acre, a considerable difference. Other crops, yes, we had quite a few of them. We'll go through them very quickly. This is the potato storage, which was then became Asgrow Seed and is now owned by PNW in town here. We did grow a lot of potatoes at one time. Hay, we're right in there with the rest of the country. This is using a roundabout driven by horses to drive a stationary baler. You can see the bales. There's the loose hay on the side. This was Tonings and Nebelsick's operation. Again, local folks. These folks are using a Jackson fork to pull the hay down into the baler, which is this case being driven by a steam engine. Today, of course, one big tractor pulling a baling machine can get the whole job done. Other tractors will handle all of what used to have to be done with stacking and storing the hay by hand. Pulse, chickpeas, lentils, green peas. We grow a lot of those in our area. When Clearwater Foods was in action down in Lewiston, they would process fresh peas, make frozen peas out of them. Those peas would be combined in the field, harvested in the field, and then brought in and run through stationary threshing machines that you see here. And the remains of these are still out at Leon. You can go out and see them. They would be replaced, of course, just like we would replace the stationary threshing machines for wheat. They would be replaced by pull-type combines in the 1980s. A couple of years ago, we saw this machine in the field. I turned the car around, went back, and said to the guy, "What on earth is that thing?" Well, they were combining fresh garbanzos or chickpeas. Didn't apparently work out too well, but we grow many, many acres, of course, of dried garbanzos today. I had to throw this one in, even though we're short on time. This is 400 hogs on 128 acres of field peas, or what's left of them, outside of Moscow. Many farmers raise hogs as an extra source of income for the grain that they were growing. And hogs were the reason, of course, that the original name of Moscow was Hog Heaven. Now, many years ago, you would have seen fields that looked like this. Beautiful blue flowers for many, many miles. This is flax. It was a very popular crop at the time. It was harvested for both its oil and for its stems, because the stems will go into making linen. So when you hear people talking about bed linens or linen shirts, that was where that material came from. Of course, today, beautiful colored pictures that we had this spring and summer from rape or canola. Again, the same thing. We don't use it to make linen, but the rape or canola oil is highly valued throughout the world. The union, we're going to shortchange them. They're worthy of an hour talk all in their own right. The first union was formed very early on. This is the guys in 1909, and the reason the union is so important is because their history is tied directly into the history of the rest of the United States at the time. Would lead eventually to Genesee Union, or PNW, which is, of course, one of the largest in the Pacific Northwest and handles literally millions of pounds of grain and other commodities every year. How do we transport our wheat? Preferably by river, which we have been able to do for a number of years now, since we have the dams built on the Snake River. Now we also have the McCoy terminal, which is relatively new, which can automatically load 100-car unit wheat trains. This is not part of the future. It's active right now. It's an amazing thing to go through when you see. And of course, we always are reminded by how important grain is by the constant visibility of Ted Holder's trucks hauling grain up and down the Lewiston Hill to the port for shipment. Now we don't have them anymore, but at one time every community had a roller mill. This is where you would process flour, and this one happens to be in Genesee. It's got a generating station right next to it, and the city would work a deal with them to provide electric power for the first 4 street lights that we had in Genesee. Prior to that, it was everything was done by kerosene lamps. Now, the early way we processed our land required oftentimes you would harvest the field and then you would have to let it lie fallow for a year to kind of regain its strength. And in this process and the way we plowed in those days, we got lots and lots of erosion. Erosion is a real enemy in the Palouse. As we've seen, the soils, although taking places, they're still finite. And when you start to get runoff like this, you can quickly lose your topsoil and then you've got worthless land. And if you fly over the Palouse, you'll see the tops of some of the fields that even though they're planted everywhere else, the tops of the fields are kind of a yellow color and nothing's growing on them. And that's the result to a large part in erosion. Another thing that we could do, and this is again out on the Smith Ranch, they would plant red clover and then just plow it under. The red clover, along with other plants like this, are nitrogen fixers. So they would put more nitrogen into the soil. Was one way that you could do it. Of course, today, the new revolution really is no-till. These giant machines go cross country. You don't need to plow anything. They can provide the fertilizer that you need. They provide the seed for these very latest species of wheat that we're growing, and it's a wonderful process. Now, occasionally you will have to go through and rework that soil a little bit, but you seldom see those old moldboard plows anymore. You might see chisel plows, which all do the same type of thing, but they don't disturb the soil as much as the moldboard plows. I never thought I'd ever see a sign like this. This is outside, it's on Herman's Ranch outside of town. This is Idaho after all. No coyote hunting allowed. Everywhere else I've been in the state, they would shoot every one of these animals they could find. What's happened? Well, with no-till, we now have a rodent infestation. And guess who eats 100 to 200 mice or voles a day? Yeah, your friendly coyote. So now they're our buddies and helping to maintain our soil quality. Homes changed considerably over the years. This is White Springs Ranch. It's open every Sunday afternoon. You should visit it. It's a wonderful museum. It's just a mile north of town. You can see exactly how people lived back in those days. The very first house that was built by the first homesteader is this little one here. It would end up with a second group that lived in there with about 10 kids and the parents living in that. Eventually, as times got better, they would add on and on and on to the house. I think there's 4 or 5 additions that were put onto this house. Same with barns. This is the Cambridge barn, which is right across the road, right across Highway 95 from the White Springs Ranch. Sat there for many years. It was typical of the barns that you needed when we had horses. They would also raise some cows in there. Then you needed the upper part of the barn to store all your hay. They're almost worthless for today's type of farming. And if you go to where that barn was, this is what I call our most modern and model farm setup right now. This is owned by Doug and Tammy Stout. It's designed to handle all of this big equipment so that you can get it out of the weather in the wintertime. A big, huge shop with every kind of facility you would want in it for taking care of this machinery. So that's what we will see more and more of. And lots of the farms today are a cross between those two. They've still got some of the old buildings and they've got the new buildings. Well, that pretty much takes us care of how our farming developed in Genesee. I guess we can ask, is farming sexy or what? This is the famous picture of Marilyn Monroe in her potato sack dress. And the potato sacks probably never have looked better. Many, many thanks to lots of people, many here who have passed on. John Ludke, for example, Marie Scharnhorst, both early historians for Genesee. Marianne Wise, who did a lot of compilation out of the Genesee News. And of course, the people that collected, the Lorang family that collected all that stuff. There's many, many more. And I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. If you're really interested in this type of thing, two awesome books are Wheat Farming, 1968, and The Horse Interlude. Both of these are in the U of I library. I don't know whether they're in the school library or not. If you're interested in having your family pictures added to this type of a presentation, please contact me. I would be more than happy to scan them or photograph them for you. If you want them in color, we can do that as well. You get the originals back and the digital copy. If you're a townie and you don't really care about the farming, you want to get a hold of the Latah Legacy from the Latah Historical Society, which has the historical walking tour of downtown Genesee. Will tell you everything that happened downtown over all these years. And I would also suggest that if you want to get look at the Genesee News yourself, it is all available digitally through the University of Idaho archives at this website, which I can give you later. You should also check with the co-op. They have a newsletter that comes out. Well, congratulations. You've made it to the end. That's over 100 slides. And I think we may have a few minutes for any questions. And thank all of you very much for coming. We greatly appreciate it.